The day I came home from 14 months in Kandahar, my husband wasn't at the airport. I told myself it was fine. He'd mentioned something about a work shift, something about the scheduling being complicated, something I'd half heard over a satellite call that kept cutting out. I stood at baggage claim in CFB Trenton civilian clothes. I'd changed before the flight, with my rucksack over one shoulder and my service dog, a 4-year-old yellow lab named Scout, pressed against my left leg. People walked past us. A little boy stopped and stared at Scout. His mother pulled him along. I watched the carousel go around and around. I called a cab. The drive from Trenton to Kingston takes about an hour and a half on 401. I watched the flat stretch of eastern Ontario go by outside the window, February, everything gray and brown and frozen. Scout put his head in my lap and I kept my hand on his back the whole ride. My husband's name was Paul. We'd been married 9 years. I'd been in the Canadian Armed Forces for 11, logistics coordination, most recently embedded with a NATO support unit in Afghanistan. Paul was a project manager at a construction firm in Kingston. We had a house on Regent Street, a gray and white 2-story with a covered porch and a maple tree in the front yard that was completely bare now, its branches like cracked glass against the winter sky. I asked the cab driver to stop at the end of the block. I don't know why. I paid him, got out, stood on the sidewalk with Scout beside me and just looked at my own house for a minute. The lights were on inside. I thought he's home. I thought maybe he got the shift covered after all. I walked up the front path. I rang the doorbell instead of using my key because 14 months is a long time and I didn't want to startle anyone. I waited. Paul opened the door. He looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd knocked on your door to ask for directions. Not surprised, not relieved. Not anything I'd been expecting for 14 months. You didn't call, he said. I sent an email, I said, 2 days ago and a text this morning from the layover in Frankfurt. He nodded slowly. Right, come in, I guess. I stood in my own hallway in my coat and boots, and I noticed things in the way you notice things when your brain is trying to make sense of something that doesn't add up. A second set of keys on the hook by the door. Not Paul's. Not mine. A coat I didn't recognize hanging on the rack. A woman's coat, dark green, expensive looking. A smell I couldn't place. Perfume, maybe, or a different detergent. Something that wasn't quite the house I remembered. Is someone here? I asked. No, Paul said. A friend was over earlier. She left. I took off my boots. I fed Scout in the kitchen. I went upstairs and I showered for 20 minutes, and I stood under the hot water and I told myself I was tired, that I was reading into things, that I'd been in a war zone, and my nervous system was still calibrated for threat detection, and this was home, this was safe, this was fine. It was not fine. Over the next 2 weeks I noticed things the way you notice water damage in a wall, not all at once, in patches. A withdrawal from our joint account I didn't recognize, $800 mid-December. Then another, $300, then $600. Small enough that maybe you'd miss them if you weren't paying attention. Large enough that they added up to something I couldn't explain away. I asked Paul about them. He said home repairs. He said Christmas. He said he'd been covering some costs because I wasn't around to help manage things, and it had been stressful. I let it go. I shouldn't have let it go. I'd been home for 3 weeks when I got the call from my bank. Not the joint account. My personal account, the one that was supposed to be mine alone. There was a credit application that had been submitted under my name. Not by me. They were calling to verify it before approving. I sat in the kitchen with Scout at my feet and I said, I didn't apply for any credit. The woman on the phone said, that's what we needed to confirm. We'll flag this and begin a fraud review. I hung up the phone and I sat there for a very long time. I didn't say anything to Paul that night. I called a lawyer instead. A woman named Ms. Hadley, who a colleague from my unit had used in a divorce proceeding 2 years prior. She told me to gather everything I could find, bank records, joint statements, any accounts in both our names. Don't move money, don't close anything, don't tip him off. What I found over the following week, while Paul was at work and Scout slept by the heating vent in the living room, was this. 2 credit cards had been opened in both our names. My signature on the applications, forged. Total outstanding balance, just over $22,000. A line of credit against the house, our house, the house I'd been paying half the mortgage on since 2016, also in both names. Nearly $40,000 drawn down. And a secondary bank account, opened 8 months prior, that had been receiving transfers from our joint account in amounts that stayed just under the threshold that would trigger automatic review. Paul had been very careful, and he had not been alone. Her name, I eventually learned, was Sandra. She'd been his colleague at the construction firm. They'd been together, apparently, for almost 2 years. She'd been the one wearing the green coat. She'd been the one with her own set of keys to my house while I was sleeping in a shared tent in Kandahar province. I want to tell you that when I found out, I screamed. That I confronted him. That I threw things and said exactly what I needed to say. I didn't. I closed the laptop. I made a cup of tea, I sat with Scout, and I looked out the window at the maple tree in the front yard. It had started snowing. I called Ms. Hadley back, and I told her what I'd found. She said, "Don't go anywhere tonight. Let me make some calls in the morning." I stayed. I moved into the guest room that night. Paul noticed but didn't say anything. I think he knew something had shifted, or maybe he was just relieved he didn't have to pretend anymore. Some people are tired of pretending, and they're almost grateful when it's over, even if the ending destroys someone else. Within a week, I had retained Ms. Hadley formally, and the process had begun. Paul was served on a Thursday afternoon. I was at a physio appointment across town when it happened, and he called me 4 times in a row. I didn't pick up. What I hadn't anticipated was my family. My mother, Pauline, was the first to call. She and my father, Ron, lived 2 hours away in Ottawa, and they'd always liked Paul. He was easy to like, affable, good at small talk. He remembered birthdays and brought wine at Christmas, and called my father Sir the first year we were together, which my father had never forgotten. I talked to Paul, my mother said. I said, "Okay, he says you've been different since you came home, that you're struggling, that you're not the same person." I said, "Mom, he opened credit cards in my name without my signature." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He told me you've been having a hard time, that you've been angry, that maybe the deployment affected you more than you're admitting." I sat in my car in the physio parking lot with Scout in the back seat, and I pressed my hand against the steering wheel, and I breathed through my nose the way my therapist on base had taught me. "I'm not imagining this," I said. "I have documentation. The bank confirmed fraud. I'm sure there's an explanation," she said. "You've been under a lot of stress." My father didn't call. He texted 3 days later. "Paul came by, we had a good talk. Think about what you're doing to this family." My sister, Heather, was 2 years younger than me, and had never entirely understood what I did in the military, or why I'd chosen it. We'd always been close in the way that sisters can be close and still exist in completely separate worlds. She called me on a Sunday evening. "I just think," she said, "that sometimes when people come back from those kinds of places, they see everything as a threat, like their brain is wired to look for danger. And maybe that's what's happening." "Heather," I said, "he forged my signature on a credit application. That's a criminal offense in Canada. You don't know it was forged." The bank confirmed it was not submitted by me. Banks make mistakes. I stopped trying to explain after that call. I didn't have the energy to keep walking people through evidence they'd decided they didn't want to see. What I had instead was Scout, and a small furnished rental in the west end of Kingston that I moved into in March, and Ms. Hadley, who was methodical and calm, and said things like, "Let the process work," in a tone that actually made me believe the process would work. I also had my friend Vivienne Marchetti, who I'd known since officer training in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu 15 years ago, and who now worked as a legal aid coordinator in Toronto. Viv drove to Kingston on a Saturday in March, with 2 bottles of good Ontario Red and a bag of Vietnamese takeout, and she sat on my second-hand couch and listened to the whole thing from the beginning. When I finished, she said, "Your family is wrong." I said, "I know. I mean, they're not just misguided, they're actually wrong. The evidence is documented, the fraud is documented. He committed a crime against you. I know. Are you okay?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered. Scout had climbed up beside me on the couch, which I'd decided I was allowing, and his weight against my side was the most solid thing in my world. "I'm not okay," I said finally. Viv laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks. The legal process moved forward the way legal processes do, slowly, with a great deal of paperwork and waiting and documents arriving in envelopes that I'd open and read and file away without feeling much of anything. Paul's lawyer was a man named Terrence who sent very long letters and seemed to specialize in making simple things complicated. In May, we had a disclosure meeting. I sat on one side of a boardroom table with Ms. Hadley. Paul sat on the other side with Terrence. Paul was wearing a tie I'd bought him for his birthday 3 years earlier. I noticed it the way you notice something small when you're trying not to feel the larger thing. Ms. Hadley laid the documentation on the table. Bank statements. copies of the credit applications with signatures that had been analyzed by a forensic document examiner, a retired RCMP officer from Ottawa named Douglas who had testified in federal court on document fraud cases. His report was 14 pages long and concluded unambiguously that the signatures on both applications were not mine. Terrence said, "Our position is that Mrs. Captain Elise Dumont," Ms. Hadley said very calmly. "Our position is that Captain Dumont may have signed these documents and simply doesn't recall." The room was very quiet. Ms. Hadley said, "Your client will need to demonstrate that in court. In the meantime, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to Exhibit 7. Exhibit 7 was the secondary bank account, the one Paul had opened to receive the transferred funds. It was in his name only. The transfers totaled just under $31,000 over an 8-month period. The destination of many of those funds, traced through Ms. Hadley's financial investigator, was a joint account held by Paul and Sandra at a different institution. Paul looked at the table. Terrence whispered something to him. Paul continued to look at the table. The meeting ended. I walked out to the parking lot where Ms. Hadley's assistant was waiting with the car. The sun was doing that thing it does in Kingston in late May, very bright and clean off the limestone buildings. I stood in it for a moment with my face tilted up. Ms. Hadley came out behind me and said, "He'll settle." He did. Not immediately. There were 3 more months of letters and revisions, and one very tense phone call between the 2 lawyers that Ms. Hadley briefed me on afterward, with the practiced neutrality of someone describing a weather event. But in August, Paul settled. The house was sold. The fraudulent debts were his to carry. My personal account was made whole. The credit applications were formally reported to the RCMP, and a file was opened. Not my case to pursue, but it was documented. It was real. It existed somewhere official that wasn't just inside my own head. I moved into a rented house on the edge of Collins Bay in September. 2 bedrooms. A yard that backed onto a field. Scout took approximately 4 seconds to decide the field was his and began doing laps around it every morning at 6:30 while I stood by the back fence with coffee and watched him. I hadn't spoken to my parents since May. My father had called twice. Once after the disclosure meeting, once in July, both times to say variations of the same thing, that I was handling this badly, that I was destroying a marriage over money, that Paul was a good man who'd made a mistake. I'd listened both times. I hadn't argued. I'd said, "I have to go," and ended the call. My sister Heather sent a text in June that said, "I hope you know what you're doing." I did know what I was doing. That was the one thing I was certain of. It was Viv who told me in October that my mother had run into Ms. Hadley at a conference in Ottawa. Ms. Hadley did some advocacy work with a national legal network, apparently, and that something had been said. I don't know the details of that conversation. I only know what happened afterward. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening in October. I was sitting on the back steps watching Scout nose around the frozen edges of the field. The maple leaves had already come down. There was a smell in the air that I associate entirely with Ontario autumn. Wood smoke and cold earth and something clean underneath it. I almost didn't answer. "Elise," my mother said. And something in the way she said my name was different from every other time she'd said it in the past 8 months. I waited. "I talked to a lawyer," she said. "Not your lawyer, just, someone explained things to me, about what document fraud actually means, and what it takes to prove it." I said, "Okay." "I didn't understand," she said. "I thought," she stopped, started again. "I thought you were angry. I thought you'd come back changed and you were looking for a reason to leave him. I thought you were making it bigger than it was." "I know what you thought," I said. I was wrong. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. My mother was not a woman who cracked easily. "Elise, I was wrong. He sat in our living room and he cried, and he told us you'd become someone he didn't recognize. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because it was easier than believing that I'd been so wrong about him for 9 years. I pressed my hand over my eyes. Scout had come over and was sitting at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me the way he does when he's deciding whether I need him close. "I should have believed you," she said. "I should have believed you from the first call. I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine yet. I didn't say I forgive you, because I wasn't entirely there yet either. I said, 'I know, Mom.' I said, 'We'll figure it out.'" My father came with her to Collins Bay 3 weeks later. He sat at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and he looked like a man who had spent some time arriving at a hard conclusion. Ron Dumont was not a man who admitted error lightly. It had taken him, by my count, the better part of a year. He said, "I let you down. I said, "You did." He nodded. He didn't argue. He just sat with it. We talked for 3 hours. Scout stationed himself between my father's chair and mine and eventually put his head on my father's knee, and my father looked down at him and some of the stiffness went out of his shoulders. After a while, my mother started telling a story about the neighbor's cat getting into their garden shed, and somehow the three of us ended up laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like years. Heather came around more slowly. She was like that. She moved carefully toward things that required her to revise her understanding of a situation. She texted in November, "Can I call?" I said yes. "We talked for an hour," she cried. I let her. She said, "I didn't know how to believe it." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have tried harder to understand." I said, "Yeah, you should have." There was a long pause and then she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm getting there." That was the honest answer. The divorce was finalized in November. I stood outside the courthouse on Ontario Street with Ms. Hadley, and the cold came off the lake in a way that Kingston does in late fall, that specific damp cold that goes right through your coat. Ms. Hadley shook my hand. She said, "You handled this well." I said, "I had a good lawyer." She smiled and went to her car. I had parked around the corner. I walked there alone. Scout was in the back seat. I'd brought him because I'd known I would need him. I opened the back door and he climbed out and we stood on the sidewalk together. And I put my hand on top of his head and I breathed. In January, I made a decision I'd been turning over for a while. I'd been on medical leave from the CAF for most of the year. My release was going through, a voluntary one, after 11 years of service. I'd done the math. I'd done the therapy. I knew what I was and wasn't ready to go back to. What I kept coming back to instead was Scout. And the other dogs I'd seen through the service animal program on base. And the veterans I knew, men and women, who'd come home to lives that didn't fit anymore, who were managing things that people without the context couldn't fully see. I'd done some research. I'd talked to a trainer in Guelph who worked with service dog placement. I'd talked to a veteran peer support coordinator in Kingston. I'd looked at what it would cost to establish a small training program, and what the gaps were in Ontario for veteran service animal support, and what a realistic first year would look like if I was careful and applied for the right grants. I spent the winter writing a business plan. In April, I signed a lease on a property east of Kingston. 3 acres, a modest building, room for runs and training space. I named it Ridgeline Working Dogs. The name came from something my unit padre had said to me once, in Kandahar, about how the Ridgeline is the place where you can see everything. Where you've been, where you're going, what's around you. I'd never forgotten it. The first dog I trained for placement was a 2-year-old shepherd cross named Hazel. Her handler was a Navy veteran from Belleville named Cyrus, who'd been home for 3 years and hadn't slept a full night in most of them. The day I handed Hazel's lead to Cyrus and watched the two of them walk to his truck, Hazel matching his pace exactly, Cyrus's shoulders dropping about an inch from where they'd been holding, that was a day I'm not going to forget. Scout retired to the property with me. He supervised training sessions from a spot by the fence and accepted treats from every veteran who came through like he was doing them a personal favor. I heard through someone at the firm that Paul and Sandra had separated. I heard it, I noted it, and I moved on. It wasn't something I needed to sit with. It wasn't something that changed anything about what I'd built. My parents came to the property opening in June. A small, informal thing, some folding tables in the yard. Viv drove up from Toronto, the veteran support coordinator came, a few other people who'd helped along the way. My mother walked around the training yard with her hand over her mouth for a moment, the way she does when she's trying not to cry and is failing. My father shook the hand of every person there. At the end of the evening, when most people had gone, and it was just my parents and Viv and me sitting in the yard with the last of the light going pink over the field, my father said, "You built something here." I said, "I did." "Without any of us," he said, and he wasn't proud of that. His voice made that clear. But he was being honest, which was more than I'd gotten from him for most of the past year. "Not entirely without you," I said. "You came back." My mother reached over and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Scout was lying in the grass nearby, watching the field in that way he has, alert to everything and calm about all of it. The light was going down. Somewhere across the property, one of the dogs in the kennel made a low sound, settled, went quiet. I had not screamed when my father closed his heart to me. I had not begged when my sister doubted me. I had not broken when my mother chose the easier story over the true one. I had not let Paul's careful destruction of my finances become the destruction of anything that actually mattered. I had done what soldiers do. I had assessed the terrain. I had identified what I needed. I had moved toward it, steadily, without waiting for anyone's permission or anyone's belief. The maple tree at the house on Regent Street was probably budding again by now. I didn't drive past it anymore. I didn't need to. I had 3 acres and a yellow lab and a building full of dogs learning how to hold someone steady in the dark. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.